going to call us back to order after lunch, so get your snacks and come have a seat. My name is Alka Menon. I'm in the sociology department at Yale University. I'm another interloper for the conference for the day, and substituting in as chair and moderator of this session. Our speakers for this session are Csiszar, who is an associate professor of history of science at Harvard University. He just finished a book titled The Scientific Journal, Authorship and the Politics of Knowledge in the 19th Century, out with Chicago Press. And our next presenter is Kaushik Rajan, who is a professor of anthropology and of the social sciences at the University of Chicago. He's also co-director of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory. Kaushik Rajan recently published the book Pharmacracy, Trials of Global Biomedicine with Duke University Press. So please, Alex.
All right. I will start by thank you again. Thanks to Lucas and Adi for this invitation. Like Stephanie and some others, I'm an historian, and so, well, historians make normative claims sometimes. Still. As a historian, I think of myself as not making normative claims. Of course, that's not true. We make normative claims all the time. But nevertheless, I have to consciously make normative claims, which I don't often do. And so I'm going to try my best, and we'll see how it goes. I've chosen this word, peer review, which when I told people I was doing peer review, said, oh, well, you know lots about that. But I actually know very little about this term, it turns out. Or at least that's what I've learned over the last week or so as I've gotten into it. I'm mostly a historian of the 19th century. As a concept, certainly as a term, peer review just does not exist in the 19th century. It's a relatively, certainly in the sciences, it kind of comes into being basically in the 60s. But what it means is really messy. It continues to be messy now. It's certainly messy back then, and historically it changes its meaning quite a bit, and I'm going to be tracking some of those meaning changes and what that means for how we should think about this term today and whether we should keep it around at all. I should say that, yes, it's messy. I'm not going to deal with all the different sorts of meanings. The center of gravity of what I'm going to be talking about is really going to be on peer review as it relates to publication practices in the sciences in particular, but also academia more generally. And much of what I'm going to be talking about is going to focus especially on the United States context. And I think that seems reasonable because as a term, I think it shows up mostly in the United States and perhaps in England first. But then it's exported, I think, to other places. And ideas about what peer review is for and how it should work have had, it seems to me, a very sort of important effect on the way in which research is practiced throughout the globe. And trying to understand how that story sort of plays out is something that I'm kind of in the middle of working on, but haven't completely figured out yet. Okay, so peer review is talked about a lot these days, and there's a set of concepts that are connected to it that are usually what people talk about when they bring up the problem of peer review. These are concepts such as bias, fairness, efficiency, cost of labor, corruptibility, and indeed whether or not it's present or not in various places and scenes. There's all of these concepts have something political kind of embedded in them. Nevertheless, the discourse about peer review is not usually explicitly these days political, and indeed I think that's because it's often imagined that peer review is exactly that one of those sorts of things that makes the practice of science not political. So a sort of good example of that is a relatively recent editorial by Drummond Rennie, who's one of the main figures who's, let's say, theorized, hasn't really theorized it, but talked a lot about peer review over the last 30 or so years. And his idea is that we need more and more empirical research to figure out how we can make peer review better, et cetera, et cetera. Although in this sort of discourse, there isn't a lot of talk about just what peer review is, why it exists in the first place, what its scope is, et cetera, et cetera. That kind of thing tends to be missing. All right. So these days, there's just a few different sorts of papers in the last year or so talking about peer review. There's various sorts of genres. One is just the state of the art of peer review, the review genre. There are many, many articles that just tell you that sort of summarize research on peer review. This is a topic that, as Barbara pointed out, research on research is big. It's an industry. This one from The Economist is a question of, is peer review actually being used? And if it's not, what does that mean for the places in which it's not being used? And then another sort of big discourse is peer review going to end? Is it going to be replaced by something else? These are all sorts of the sorts of places, sorts of ways in which peer review is talked about these days. And I should say that when people use the term peer review in these sciencey sorts of contexts, they might mean a lot of different things. They might be talking about grants review. They might be talking about tenure cases. They might be talking about all sorts of different sorts of places in which peers, whatever those are, review and pass judgment on others. But it seems to me when you see the term most often unmarked, it tends to refer these days to these scenes of publishing. In some way, and these scenes of deciding whether something ought to be out in the public domain or not. And that's significant because that's very much a sort of new sort of development. All right, the sort of moment that I'm going to, the question that I'm going to focus especially on is a question that's been very big in the last year or two, and this is a question about whether peer review might be replaced or altered through automation. So peer review, should we let the robots take over? That refers to various things. More sort of proximately is a set of questions associated especially with this movement called altmetrics, which talks about perhaps replacing what it calls traditional peer review with various sorts of algorithmic judgment and aggregation. So this is a manifesto for altmetrics. One of the key people for altmetrics is a fellow named Jason Preem. In a paper of his a few years ago called Beyond the Paper, he wrote, "The web opens the workshop windows to disseminate scholarship as it happens. Over the next 10 years, the view through these open windows will inform powerful online filters. These will distill communities' impact judgments algorithmically, replacing the peer review and journal systems. So there's a lot going on here, and there's a lot of figuring what kind of thing peer review is sort of implicitly here. And it's done by opposing it to some other sort of mode of judgment, we might call it algorithmic judgment. And so peer review, it seems to me, is figured as traditional, as slow, as opposed to sort of being fast and instant, as being subjective or qualitative rather than objective and quantitative. Those are two separate things. It's artisanal rather than algorithmic. It tends to be something that's really best on paper, whereas the web allows you to do other sorts of things. It's closed rather than open. It's secret rather than accountable. And it's corruptible rather than hard to corrupt. Not all of that is in this little quote, but in the stuff that Preem and others write about it. That's the sort of set of oppositions through which peer review is being figured. All right, so that's all very interesting. I find it interesting because it's so, even just a few years, even just like 10 years ago, this particular way of thinking of peer review, I think, wouldn't have made a lot of sense. The other thing to be said about this is a lot of these binaries are sort of inherently political, but the kind of discourse and the kind of conversation about why we might replace peer review doesn't really get too much into the details, at least explicitly, of politics. Rather, it tends to be a question of whether something can be replaced by something else to do the same job. So we have ways of judging work that create quality science. That question about what constitutes quality and what constitutes science tends to be kept relatively fixed in this discourse. And instead, what's being discussed is how can we come up with a better way to do this more efficiently, sort of improve something that's sort of doing a job but not doing it very well. Whereas it seems to me that, and this is where eventually the kind of intervention I would want to make in this goes, what we ought to do is sort of step back and ask, more specifically, what do we mean by open? What do we mean by objective? What do we mean by quality science? And then let us think about what sorts of judgment procedures might be relevant in those sorts of contexts. All right. Now, as I say, this is a very specific way of thinking about, talking about peer review that wouldn't have made sense a whole lot earlier than this, and certainly wouldn't have made sense when the term sort of enters American discourse about science. Now I'm going to kind of do my little historical genealogy that will get us back to here. It's going to take me a few minutes to do it. I'm not going to go back we could go back a little earlier than this, but I'm going to go back only to 1972 to Alvin Weinberg, American physicist, kind of a public intellectual, very much a science administrator during the Cold War in the United States. Most famous probably for big science, that term. Less famous for trans science. But this was another one of his sort of key concepts at a moment that he was trying to get people to take up. People didn't quite take up. But his essays on science and trans science are really interesting from the point of view of the way in which the term and potentially the concept of peer review was being mobilized in the early 70s and the late 60s. So this is a bit of a long quote, I apologize, but it's useful. Scientific truth is established by the traditional methods of peer review. Only what has value in the intellectual marketplace survives. By contrast, where trans science is involved, wisdom, rather than truth, must be arrived at by some other mechanism. Our society is experimenting with procedures, either adjudicative or political, for making the delicate judgments of value that underlie the resolution of trans scientific questions. We scientists value our Republic of Science with its rigorous peer review. The uninformed public is excluded from participation in the affairs of the Republic of Science, rather as a matter of course. But when what we do transcends science and impinges on the public, we have no choice but to welcome participation. So, very clearly, peer review is being invoked here as a means of separating different sorts of judgment practices in different sorts of communities. Peer review is something that happens among this thing coming to be called by this point the scientific community. It involves experts. It doesn't involve the public. The moment matters of public concern come in, trans science might eventually, I think maybe regulatory science would be sort of what he was talking about here, which is a term that maybe sort of took on what trans science might have been. When it's regulatory science, of course that's political. Of course we have to think carefully about the politics of judgment. But peer review is this other thing. And it's what allows scientists to not worry about that political stuff. So this is relatively, I think, comparable even to current uses of peer review. But what's very different is that here, it's not connected to any particular set of practices. There's no assumption about what specifically peer review entails. It's a very general sort of idea about the scientific community coming up with truth in what often is called a self-correcting sort of manner. And the other thing to be noticed here is that the language he's using is actually very political. So Republic of Science, intellectual marketplace, those are terms that have already come into play, especially through the writing of Michael Polanyi, who makes no bones about making a political claim about how science works. Starting in the 1940s. Very famous essay in the first issue of Minerva, which is also where Science and Trans Science, the longer version, comes out. Very famous essay by Polanyi called The Republic of Science, which begins, my title is intended to suggest that the community of scientists is organized in a way which resembles certain features of the body politic and works according to economic principles similar to those by which the production of material goods is regulated, and so on and so on. So Polanyi wants to make strong claims about the way in which science works, and he's very keen to insist that it should be separated from certain kinds of politics, but it in itself is a sort of political theory, and he's very, very upfront about that. And indeed, well, peer review don't come up in this, don't come up for him too much. But what does come up, interestingly, often for him, and in a way that turns out to be significant, is the sort of other term I haven't talked about yet, which is the referee. So these days, again, it seems to me that when one says peer review, most of my actors that I'm talking about here, associated with a set of practices connected to an individual called the referee. That isn't the case in this earlier moment. When people talk about scientific referees or referees of scholarly publications, they tend not to use the term peer review. Nevertheless, it's sort of floating around. And Polanyi is really one of the key early people who starts talking about the referee as an important scientific personage who matters in all sorts of ways, in a universal sort of way. And when he talks about the referee, though, it's not so much to say that, of course, referees are everywhere, but rather that we can understand a lot about how science works by following the exploits of this particular kind of individual. So to talk about consensus in science, he writes, and this is in 1946, this is a very early Polanyi text with regard, in terms of his writing on science, and it gets picked up a lot by people interested in the subject later on. He writes, the harmony between the views independently held by individual scientists shows itself also in the way they conduct the affairs of science. We've seen that there's no central authority exercising power over scientific life. It's all done at a multitude of dispersed points at the recommendation of a few scientists who happen either to be officially involved or drawn in as referees for the occasion. And yet, in general, such decisions do not clash, but on the contrary, can rely on wide approval. Two scientists acting unknown to each other as referees for the publication of one paper usually agree about its approximate value. So the referee is an example here, and it's not something he's too worried about. You know, there's no research saying that this is actually true, that there's consensus among referees. He's pretty sure it is the case, and he's quite willing to invoke it to discuss the way in which consensus happens in this relatively smooth sort of manner. So let's see, back to Weinberg. Weinberg himself is not so much talking about those particular procedures, but they're sort of in the background of all sorts of things that might be understood as peer review, not simply what goes on with refereeing, but all the sorts of informal processes by which science kind of self-corrects itself. And this is part of a lot of writing that happens in the 60s and 70s connected to this idea that there is a scientific community. Much of this is in the United States, most obviously Hagstrom's book, The Scientific Community, a bunch of others. John Zimon's actually British, but very much in dialogue with others talking about this notion that there's this community that is separate, works in ways, the judgment happens in ways that are not political. The other key person in all of this is Robert K. Merton and then his students. Merton most famously has basically a kind of political conception of what makes science work, at least a conception of what makes science work that's very connected to matters of politics that he develops in the 30s and 40s, connected to a kind of normative structure, universalism, communism, disinterestedness, organized skepticism. Interestingly, he then sort of steps back from this kind of work, but when he reemerges doing sociology of science in the late 50s and 60s, the story's a little bit changed. You can actually see it through the changing titles of a particular famous paper. The normative structure paper was initially called A Note on Science and Democracy, then it becomes Science and Democratic Social Structure, and by 1976, in another republication, it's the normative structure of science. So there's a kind of Merton stage 2 that gets going basically in the 1960s, and again, it's about the internal dynamics of the scientific community, more or less, rather than the question about the relationship between science and politics. This is pretty well-known stuff that people like David Hollinger and others have talked a fair amount about. And what happens in this new work is it's all of a sudden going to be a lot more empirical. That's his hope. He's got students, he's got collaborators, so he needs to take these sort of mamby-pamby norms and make them operational. He needs to do things with them that he can sort of locate actual examples of the normative structure at work. So now he's got a new language of reward system, peer evaluation, which sort of stands in many cases for organized skepticism, property rights, and things like that. The first big paper in this is Priorities in Scientific Discovery, and various papers follow. Most importantly here, a really the biggest publication still probably ever on referee systems is 1971. That's written in very close collaboration with Harriet Zuckerman, and is really kind of the first sort of major study of referee systems. Again, the word peer review is missing here. Peer review is being used by these people, but in this very general way. When they talk about specific practices, they don't tend to use it. They use this term referee system. This paper had 3 parts. It sort of presented a kind of history of the referee system, which was very interesting but ambiguous. They sort of surveyed acceptance rates at various journals within the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities, and they got access to an archive of referee reports and things like that from Physical Review, and they did various sorts of statistics on that and sort of tried to sort of follow authorship practices and things like that. One of their fun facts that they learned is that actually rejection rates in the natural sciences are extremely low. as compared to humanities and social sciences, where rejection rates tended to be very much higher. The way in which they interpreted this was very much along Polanyi's lines, which is, well, sure, because there's generally consensus already happening in the natural sciences, so things just tend to work out that everybody kind of agrees, whereas where there's no consensus in fields like history and language and literature, everybody rejects everything all the time. So the point is, they're interested in this, but they don't take it to be the key way in which judgment happens in science. It's more, they're interested in status judges as part of the idea that science is a profession, but there's no sense in which this is sort of where judgment happens exclusively in the sciences. One other sort of place this is coming up that's sort of a key context for what's going to happen is at the same time that people are talking more and more about referee systems and studying them, citation analysis gets going and metrics get going. This is important because right now the discourse about peer review is often as this traditional thing that's being replaced by metrics. But what one finds when one looks at what's going on in this period is that these two sorts of ways of talking about science, measuring it, judging it, studying it, kind of happen together. So people become interested in referee systems at the same time that they become interested in citation analysis. And these two things are very much mutually supported. The person who invents or sort of promulgates citation data is Eugene Garfield. He gets Derek DeSola Price to write various editorials trying to convince authors and editors and referees to behave in particular ways. If you're going to use metrics, you need sort of the idea is you need standardized publication practices, and referees have a key role to play in standardizing scientific communication. So the peer review system, or I should say the referee system, is crucial to the way people are thinking about whether citation metrics are going to be usable. This sort of more general notion of peer review sort of continues on in the 70s, except for in the case of grants review. So if there's a specific meaning for peer review in the 1970s, it's not to do with refereeing, although that occasionally gets used that way. It's to do with grants peer review in the United States, connected especially to the NSF and NIH. So when you see peer review in a specific way, it tends to be about grants, but it's often also used in this very general way to talk about this various self-correcting mechanisms of the scientific community through the 1970s. All right, that changes completely in the 1980s, very quickly. And it happens at what I've come to see as a really key event in the history of peer review, the concept, 1981, the hearings on fraud in biomedical research. These are chaired by Senator Albert Gore. Why do they happen? They happen because there's a few one reason they happen is a few very publicized controversies over fraud in biomedical research. And if the state is going to fund this, well, then we should figure out what's going on. So Gore, who's the head of the subcommittee on investigations and oversight for the Committee of Science and Technology, helps organize these hearings. He leads it off, and he has a bunch of leading questions for his various witnesses who are going to come and testify. Here they are. I'll just focus on a few, and these are great. This is really important. Is science really self-correcting? Is the peer review process working adequately? What responsibility do referees and journal editors have to ensure the integrity of data? So key here is that there's a little ambiguity as to what peer review means here. It might be this very general thing. It might be this more specific thing connected in particular to the ways in which editors decide what to publish. My sense is it seems the context suggests he means that more specific meaning, which is interesting, again, because it's not used that often in that way. And indeed, it creates lots of confusion during the testimony itself. In particular, the first person to give evidence into this statement is Philip Handler, president of the National Academy of Sciences, and his statement, which is, the first statement, is really quite interesting in this regard. The matter of falsification of data, I contend, need not be a matter of general societal concern. It is rather, given the size of the total research effort, a relatively small matter generated within and is normally effectively managed by the scientific community itself. It occurs in a system that operates in an effective, democratic, self-correcting mode, the very peer review system of which your letter makes mention. And then various other things about this falsification of data, but in the hot cauldron of the operation of peer review in the scientific world, false data cannot long survive undetected. So the point here is that, well, the thing I'm most into, well, I should say, this turns out to be an infamous statement now because it didn't go over well with Gore at all. But key, and people don't talk about this so much, he seems to have, if I'm right about what Gore thought he meant by peer review, he's completely misunderstood what Gore was talking about. He's talking here about these general modes of self-correction, very much the sort of 1960s, 1970s way of using the term peer review. There's nothing here about any sort of formal procedure, and that's very much the way he's thinking about this. And this really annoys Gore and various other people on the committee. The next day, he says, we heard from some of the most distinguished members of the American scientific community that the problem of fraud is essentially a private one that should be dealt with by informal codes of the scientific community. In one short hour, the subcommittee went from the Olympian heights of a non-problem to the depths of a potential perjury once they heard about all the terrible things going on. So this is a complete failure, It works out very, very badly for the people testifying in terms of making their claim that science ought to be left alone. You immediately have lots and lots of published stuff on fraud in science. Scientific misconduct fraud becomes a sort of general category of public debate, most famously this book by Broad and Wade in 1982, who interestingly also used peer review in this sort of general way, whereas refereeing they use in a more specific way. But that changes very quickly. I'll skip this. This book is a book, I should say, that Merton did not like very much. Merton thought this was terrible. I urge you not to buy the book because that would support the authors. Merton says in History of Science, etc. All right, but a million things happen very quickly. Things change very quickly. All of a sudden, we have lots and lots of studies of peer review, by which is meant referee practices. One of the first big ones after this is 1982. Peters and Ceci, they do what is probably the first hoax study. There's lots of hoax studies to do with peer review now, which we can talk about, but I won't too much. This is the first one I found, but it's kind of a reverse hoax because what they do is they take a published paper and they resubmit it in various places, and they find out that almost everybody rejects it, interestingly. This is partly, again, there wasn't so much worry about stuff getting through the referee system until a little later on. So this is sort of a hybrid moment after this hearing, but still sort of playing with a set of concerns that were more active in the 70s than the 80s. Lots more stuff. There's a book in 1985. A set of conferences get going in mid-80s on studying peer review. That's where Drummond Rennie comes in from the beginning. And then there's more hearings about misconduct. The next one is 1986. This one is about publishing. And now if you read this, peer review always means pre-publication referee. There's no ambiguity anymore. Its meaning has very, very quickly shifted over among the witnesses testifying to pre-publication refereeing, and there's a lot of focus on it. There's also focus on what happens when it fails, and so there's lots of interest here in retraction. So the rise of retraction is very tied up with these sets of hearings, and indeed with the coming into being of peer review as this sort of key process of science, and this is where it's happening. What else? Ethics guides start to talk about peer review as central to the practice of science. So this is 1989, National Academy of Sciences. While publication in a peer-reviewed journal remains the standard means of disseminating scientific results, other methods of communication are subtly altering how scientists divulge and receive information, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is fascinating for a couple of reasons. One is that by 1989, peer review is already being replaced by other things, which is crazy because it just came into existence as a concept, more or less, it seems to me. And it's already something that seems like it might be being pushed out. It's sort of a traditional thing that's being replaced by other things. That's kind of crazy. And indeed, a whole sort of historiography of the origins of peer review gets created around this time, sort of based on the Merton-Zuckerman paper, but doing crazy things with it. The idea basically being that peer review was there at the beginning of modern science, which happened in Europe and it happened in the 17th century. And one of the reasons is they had the right social structure and techniques. Lots and lots of stuff on that. And this is still very much the narrative you hear about it. And the other thing that happens, and you can see it in this phrase, the peer-reviewed journal, peer review becomes a means of classification. There are things that are peer-reviewed and there are things that are not. Again, this is not something that existed earlier. So certain, and in publishing properly, as you can see here, means publishing in peer-reviewed journals. And publishing improperly would be publishing places that are not peer-reviewed. So it becomes a principle of classification. Another way that comes up is in discussing science sort of across the globe. So people who become, scientometricists in particular, who become interested in tracking the growth of science in different sorts of places, use it by tracking the growth of the reputable literature, which is essentially understood as something like the well peer-reviewed literature. So a key person for this is Eugene Garfield, who invents the Science Citation Index, talks about science in the third world, and basically explains that good science is the sort of stuff that is both refereed and gets lots of citations. But to get lots of citations, you have to be cited by people who are in good journals, and all those good journals are in Western countries. And so all the good science is happening in the Western world, more or less. There's pushback on that starting in the 1990s for good reasons. This stuff is quite fascinating. Anyway, there's pushback on this that happens probably earlier, but really sort of very public pushback in the 1990s, stating that most of this is against metrics, but it's also ultimately against the whole idea that there's a sort of standardized way of publishing. And Garfield pushes back on the pushback. And instead of sort of saying it's all about citation, he points out that it's also about just good publication practice, and good publishing practice is all about peer review. All right, so, and these sorts of phenomena in which a particular standardized way of thinking about peer review is sort of exported into lots of places, comes up a lot. So this John Bohannon piece, Who's Afraid of Peer Review, if you know it, is sort of this big, so-called sort of quintupled, which he ran a few years ago. But it's very sort of interesting from the point of view of the geopolitics of science. And peer review is the other sort of thing that happens finally. I know I'm out of time. The other big thing that happens is that discussions of peer review become central to the legitimacy of science more generally. So lots and lots of climate science talk. Climate science deniers in particular are very keen on talking about the way in which science is dependent on its refereed scientific literature, on peer review, and if that process can be seen to be faulty in any way, that suggests that science itself is faulty. Of course, if you're defending climate science, as my colleague Oreskes and her co-author Conway are doing, you have a choice whether you want to sort of invoke peer review or not. And they tend to, but they tend to do it in exactly this ambiguous way, which harkens back to those earlier definitions of peer review. And yet they're, of course, read in ways that are, well, complicated in this regard, especially because they do talk about the specific notion of peer review in other places. So back to the beginning. It seems to me that what's going on in this sort of moment in talking about automating peer review is really is taking it into sort of even newer territory, and I'm not going to get too much into it. But the way it's doing it is actually kind of a holdover to these other ways of simply thinking about issues surrounding bias, fairness, without really talking too much about why we care about fairness, why we care about bias, and what kind of system of judgment we want for the sciences and the humanities in general, who ought to be involved in deciding this. These are questions of the geopolitics of knowledge that is almost completely separate, is completely not taken into account in these debates. It remains a kind of question about efficiency and what sort of is scientifically most feasible for producing a system that will simply produce the best science. But we need to have a conversation that's a political conversation about what constitutes best science and whether that's a useful term at all. All right, I'll stop.
So now you know about my PowerPoint skills. Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be here, and geopolitics of knowledge is a nice handoff. Alex, thank you. This is going to be a slightly odd paper and fairly self-indulgent as well, in that it's not going to be terribly empirical, but it's kind of a personal genealogy of how I'm thinking about value, who I'm thinking it with, both in my own work and collaboratively. And I'm interested in this question of value, not as a thing in itself, but methodologically, as in how do we deal with this question of value. And for me personally, I can't answer that question without talking a lot about Marx. So the forewarning is that there's a lot of Marx in this paper. Okay. So the question of value has been at the core of my work more or less from the beginning. So when I received this invitation, I had an opportunity to go back and look at how I've been thinking about the question of value throughout my work. In my first book, Biocapital, the question of value was omnipresent but somewhat implicit in its theorization. My second book, Pharmacracy, on the other hand, was explicitly concerned with the question of value. In between the two, I had organized a long series of collaborative conversations, the edited volume Lively Capital, and a series of workshops on the theme knowledge/value that explored the question of value alongside other anthropologists of science and STS scholars whom I've been working closely with over the past few years. Many of them do not adopt the same Marxian approach to the question of value that I do, so what emerged in fact were different methodological and conceptual trajectories and genealogies to this question. So what I'm about to offer up today is my own conceptual trajectory, and this is thinking about how I've used it in Biocapital, Pharmacracy, how it emerged in knowledge value, and I'm going to work through it in the following three registers. Right? First, value as a polyvalent category that has, within capitalist modes and relations of production, the question of surplus at its core. And this is a question that I explore fundamentally through a reading of Marx and concerns the dynamics of capital in Biocapital. Second, but that also articulates to regimes of norms and knowledge that are potentially external to, yet appropriable by, capitalist modes and relations of production. So this is a question of the co-production of value in its polyvalence with the ethical and the epistemic, the problem, broadly speaking, of knowledge/value. And third, that materializes politically in ways that put questions of life and/or health at stake in historically, geographically, and institutionally situated ways, a question that requires attention to the global political economy of biomedicine and speaks to the problem space of pharmacracy. So value is one of those words that imply different things. On the one hand, it implies the market value that is realized through processes of exchange. On the other, it implies the non-market values, what might be called in shorthand that has led to the term's own black boxing, ethics. This is particularly salient for industries such as the biotech and pharmaceutical, which generate significant symbolic capital from being, as they're never averse to pointing out, in the business of making health and saving lives. Market valuation depends upon notions of value that are deemed somehow external to the market, while at the same time, the ethical gets increasingly encroached upon, co-opted by, and made answerable to systems of market valuation. This has consequences for value in both senses of the word. On the one hand, this implosion makes technoscience more driven by market value. On the other, it troubles, displaces, and puts at stake the Mertonian normative structure of science based on values of universality, disinterestedness, communism, and organized skepticism. Add to this ideas of epistemic value, what counts as good knowledge, but also when something becomes valuable because it is factual, and one is confronted with a complex and politically salient conceptual category. Further, value operates at multiple scales, from the local to the global, and perhaps the planetary as well. Attending to the historical and geographic context out of which value materializes is essential to resist a positivist rendering of value. The economy of bioeconomy, which is what I'm interested in, therefore refers not just to quantitative measures of productivity or profit, but to the regimes of value, both material and symbolic, that form the theater of political articulation. So, as I said, I'm going to spend much of my time today thinking about value through a reading of Marx, but to do so in ways that are faithful to Marx's own method involves situating the question of value within the conjunctural specificities that one is elucidating. This involves attending to the ways in which the nature of the market, its value systems and epistemologies, are themselves shifting under the sign of increasingly financialized and monopolizing corporate capital. The relationship between the technoscientific and the political economic is not one of cause and effect. It's not that the life sciences and biomedicine change because of capitalism or financialization, nor are capitalism and financialization a consequence of the biotech revolution or changes in sectoral industrial logics of drug development. Rather, we confront mutually implicated and emergent epistemologies and systems concerning life and health on the one hand and value on the other, an example of what Sheila Jasanoff has termed co-production. This co-production occurs under the sign of certain value systems that are themselves historically specific. Right? So the problem is twofold. On the one hand, elucidating the historical and sectoral specificities of a technoscientific capitalism operating within financializing global capitalism. On the other hand, doing so while remaining attentive to the dynamics of capital under which financialization operates. Right? So that's the kind of overarching problem space. So a little bit of Marx then, actually a lot of Marx. So in order to elaborate how I think about value, I find it particularly useful to turn to the way in which Marx analytically conceptualized it in relation to labor and capital. Marx insisted that any proper understanding of capital has to come from beginning the analysis with the question of value, and he says as much in the Grundrisse. To develop the concept of capital, we have to begin not with labor, but with value. This does not mean that labor is unimportant, just that one can only understand how it comes to be at stake, alienated and exploited, if one begins one's analysis with value. And for capital, value had no meaning unless it's surplus value. For money to be capital, it must have the potential for generating surplus within it as it circulates in processes of commodity exchange. Marx locates the generation of surplus value not in the labor that the worker exchanges for wage from the capitalist, but in the potential of the worker to perform work in excess of that wage. Marx terms this potential labor power, the potential for the worker to generate more labor than that adequated by wage. The methodological insight here is that capital generates value through an exploitation of bodily potential, even as the generation of value becomes an end in itself. As creative potential, labor power is not predetermined value. Therefore, an apparent act of equivalent exchange, workers' labor for capitalists' wages, has hidden within it an element of non-equivalence. Because wages are fixed remuneration, but labor, which is actually labor power, is the potential for the creation of value over and above the money expended in wages. Surplus value, Marx says, is in general value in excess of the equivalent. Further, value is that which allows the commodity, which is always the product of specific and concrete human labor, to figure as abstract labor. At the core of Marx's account of the dynamics of capital is his insistence that value is an abstraction device. The key here is that labor power is an entirely abstract concept, and yet it is in this abstract concept that the fundamental dynamics of capital rests. This abstraction stems entirely from the structural material relations of production, because it is an abstraction that can only be enabled by the fact that the capitalist controls the material means of production. Therefore, at the very heart of Marx's analysis of capital is a dialectic between materiality and abstraction. Therefore, on the one hand, value is simply an attribute, something that a commodity has, its utility, its beauty, its ability to be worn or eaten, something that money has, its ability to circulate itself, to mediate and measure various kinds of circulations. But on the other hand, value itself performs the various materializations and abstractions of those things that it is simply supposed to represent. And this is a long Marx quote from Capital that I'm not going to leave up for a while. This is my PowerPoint, basically. This is the sum total, right? So I won't read it all out loud, but basically, both money and commodity function as different modes of existence of value. It's constantly changing from one form to another. But the things that I've emphasized are the things that are critical for me. In the process of this, it becomes transformed into an automatic subject, if we pin down specific forms of appearance, by self-valorizing value in the course of its life, value's life. Capital's money, capital's commodities. In truth, value is the subject, the independently acting agent, which valorizes itself independently. By virtue of being value, it has acquired the occult ability to add value to itself. This is Marx talking about value just before he introduces the concept of surplus value in Volume 1 of Capital. It's an extraordinary passage. So this definition of capital in terms of self-valorizing value is significant, but not the point at which Marx's explanation runs out. Rather, it signifies, in Gayatri Spivak's terms, the possibility of an indeterminacy. The ability to add value to itself is precisely that which renders capitalist value appropriative of labor, turning it into surplus, but also in other situations of health, turning it into surplus, or ethics, turning it into surplus. It is also that which renders the generation of capitalist value political, a politics that plays out through both the consolidation and the contestation of modes and relations of power and production. Hence, an ethnographic elucidation of these relations and of their consolidation and contestation allows us to work backwards towards the conceptualization of the capitalist value form itself. How does this relate to health, which is my interest? The most literal answer to this question has been provided by Joseph Dumit, who developed the notion of surplus health as an analogy to Marxian surplus labor. This refers to the market value that pharmaceutical capital gains from the potential for future illness of those who might one day consume drugs, which includes anyone with the buying power to constitute a market for therapeutics and crucially excludes those without. Empirically, Dumit studied the growth of pharmaceutical marketing in the United States in the second half of the 20th century and its imbrication with the growth of clinical trials, a trajectory that has resulted in the progressive growth of prescription rates in this country with no signs of stopping. Analytically, Dumit substituted Marxian labor-related keywords with health-related keywords in Volume 1 of Capital. In the process, Dumit generated a health theory of value that is literally analogous to Marxian labor theory. It was literally a search and replace in Volume 1 of Capital, showing how value creates health that is appropriate to and appropriable by capital, alienated from embodied healthiness. Value thus is that which allows the symptom, which is always the product of specific and concrete human health, to figure as abstract health. Even as health itself comes to be at stake, so too does labor, as biomedical economies engender both multiplications and divisions of labor, especially seen in the various proliferations and dislocations of experimental subjectivity in clinical trials. There's a further tangle here because value is never just about surplus, it also refers to the ethical and the normative. Often pharmaceutical corporate capital is contested by taking recourse to seemingly opposed value systems grounded in ethics and morality, for instance, by an insistence on the ethical conduct of clinical trials and human subjects experimentation based in principles of good clinical practice, or by demands for equitable and broad access to essential medicines. But at the same time, pharmaceutical companies also appropriate ethics for their own purposes. So one could envisage a value that is defining of capital, but also an alternative normative framework to capital. So these latter forms of value are never entirely outside the fold of capital, are always appropriated by it, and this is where some of the politics comes in, right? Is the normative dimension of value outside capital contesting it, or is it appropriated by capital? So that's the first part. The second part is considering the relationship of value to knowledge. The question of biocapital cannot simply concern itself with the question of value, rather it concerns the relationship between value and knowledge. The form of this problem is similar to that which Michel Foucault was exploring in considering what he referred to as power/knowledge. Through an analysis of epistemology, including especially in its discursive and institutional forms and manifestations, Foucault was able to open up different ways of conceptualizing power. Questions of value present similar kinds of analytic challenges. This is especially so when seen in the context of the mutations, overdeterminations, and crises of contemporary capital, in the context of new technoscientific emergence. Both knowledge and value are unsettled categories that require problematization. So too is the nature of their historical coming together. So we need to ask ourselves, why knowledge/value, why now? Right? The question of history and conjuncture. So I want to present the problem space of knowledge/value to you in two ways. One, following the extremely schematic rendering of Marx's account of surplus value that I've just given you, is to suggest that the question of knowledge is integral to Marx's own methodology. And second is to briefly suggest ways in which the materialization of value occurs in different regimes of technoscientific knowledge production, especially as the technoscientific comes to be appropriated increasingly by capital. So in his development of the concept of surplus value, back to Marx again, Marx is analyzing capitalist exchange, but what is capitalist exchange? Is it concept, is it practice, is it system? This is in fact crucial, because in order to grasp what Marx is trying to do, one has to constantly shift registers between looking at concepts, practice, systems, objects. How to do that remains a live methodological challenge today, as it did for Marx. I would suggest that in fact Marx was not doing systemic analysis in any simple sense. He was not trying to understand capitalism, because capitalism as a singular is an absurdity. It never existed in his time or sense. Systems of capitalist exchange certainly have, but they're constantly fluid and emergent. What Marx was trying to do, rather, was understand capital. What is capital, though? Materially, money and commodities. Yet money and commodities by themselves do not constitute capital. They've existed well before capitalism. So they only become capital when operational in a system geared towards the generation of surplus. So here one confronts a tautology of a system that only makes sense in terms of the modality of functioning of the objects that constitute that system, objects that themselves only function as constituents of that system when already situated within those systemic logics. So what is this thing that breaks this tautology between, is capital and money defined by capitalism, or is capital defined by capital and money? It's labor. Who comes up with this answer? Not Marx. He's playing off of this fact, which is already well known by the time of his writing. It's well known because political economy, an emergent but already powerful body of knowledge, said so. The analysis of labor power, crucially, comes not from an empirical observation of the accrual of value, but from the critique of political economy. Political economy's own analysis of capital failed to account for the fact that if labor was simply a mediator in a process of exchange, and that labor was free and remunerated, then it was capital that kept growing while labor was exploited and alienated. This is what political economy failed to explain. This is what political economy failed to explain. Thus, Marx's critique of capital is not a critique of capitalism, which would have been an absurdity, and it could not have been a critique of exchange per se, because there was no way of empirically accessing exchange per se, except through the means available to know it. In other words, Marx, I argue, was, especially in his later writings, critiquing the ways in which we came to understand capitalist exchange, political economy, right? An epistemic critique. After all, capital is subtitled a critique of political economy, not a critique of capitalism or a critique of capital. Political economy failed to take into account the history of capital, whose dynamics it claimed to explain, yet it functioned as authoritative knowledge. So what I'm suggesting here is that at this moment, Marx is methodologically an epistemologist, even as he's a structuralist, a historian, an anthropologist, a philosopher of abstraction and naturalization, and so on and so forth. Indeed, Marx cannot understand capital except through epistemology. Now, this doesn't mean that political economy determines capitalism. Rather, what one sees is the development of an analytic that traces the co-production of modes and relations of production with regimes of knowledge. So Marx is looking at systems and regimes of exchange and value that are made intelligible and naturalized through knowledge that in turn responds to these forms of exchange and value in its own authoritative development. So Marx presents us with a challenge of method and conceptualization, how to think the co-production of value and knowledge with the determination in the last instance by the economic. Right? And let's remember that determination in the last instance is not determination. It's a very complex, that's a whole other. Thus, there's an aspect of the co-production of knowledge and value at the very heart of the labor theory of value. Yet there is also at the same time the question of knowledge regimes as externalities that can be encroached upon or appropriated by capitalist modes and relations of production, thus bringing forth new articulations of knowledge/value. And it was this latter question that myself and a number of colleagues explored between 2011 and 2014 through a series of workshops organized at the University of Chicago, the University of California, Davis, and Exeter University on the theme knowledge/value. In conceptualizing the series, our attempt was to look for middle terms or critical sites that could speak to the problematic of knowledge/value in ways that could productively unpack their indeterminacies, overdeterminations, and multiple determinations. What we came up with were a series of topical frames for the workshops that operated at different scales and registers. So the first one reinterrogated the nature of the fact-value distinction. The other workshops were organized more thematically around translational research and experimental biology, information databases and archives, property and intellectual property, and dark data and non-knowledge. And each of these workshops was organized by someone else in a different university and so on. And what emerged across these workshops was a whole range of conceptualizations of value in relation to technoscience. Right? So my own conceptualization is deeply influenced by Dumit's reading of Marx, which I've just given you. But for instance, some of the other conceptualizations that came up across these workshops, by no means comprehensive, include Laurent Baudet and Jean-Paul Gaudelier's focus on use values in pharmaceutical development through a study of reformulation practices in Ayurveda, Chris Peterson's focus on the constitution of different kinds of markets in Nigeria, from monopoly markets in patent medications to markets in generic drugs, to informal markets in fake and counterfeit drugs, all operating in the same physical spaces of exchange. Maurice Cassier's ongoing study of the reconstitution of modes of production and industrial organization of pharmaceutical manufacture, Corey Hayden's analysis of the politics of the copy, focusing on the values and politics entailed in the constitution of novelty, similarity, and genericity of pharmaceuticals, Kim Nguyen's analysis of the ways in which diseased bodies come to be valued in biomedical situations of emergency, such as HIV/AIDS in Africa, work that thinks about pharmaceutical value in terms of embodiment and bodily relations, so in different ways, Julie Livingston's and Lachlan Jane's analysis of cancer as bodily and political economic relation, work that elaborates value in relation to institutions of national and global health, Veena Das's focus on everyday practices of pharmaceutical consumption and the experience of health and illness, Judy Farquhar's and Lily Lai's focus on relating value to questions of epistemology in their work on ethnic Chinese medicine, and various kinds of what Donna Haraway calls encounter value that mediate trans-species and multi-species interactions in the life sciences. And here also I'm thinking of Gail Davies' work on the geographies of mouse research, Natalie Porter's on securitized economies of bird flu, Jake Skosek's on the history of the industrialized honeybee. So a whole range of approaches to thinking knowledge/value together. One of the key features, in spite of this huge diversity of methods to conceptualize knowledge-value relations, one of the key features that came up across our conversations was that the problem space of knowledge does not just concern the question of truth, as it so centrally did for Foucault in Power Knowledge, but is centrally concerned with the movements of knowledge. Indeed, the transformations that define what counts as knowledge in any given domain can only be identified and traced by looking at knowledge in transit, as different communities select and attribute meaning to various knowledge forms through a complex nexus of commitments and frames. In our view, the question of knowledge concerns itself primarily with movements across domains and what counts as knowledge in movements across domains. These domains could be institutional and disciplinary, lab to clinic, biology to medicine, academia to industry, spatial, animal facility to lab bench, geographical and transnational, the globalization of research to different parts of the world, upstream research to downstream research, and so on. So this question of mobility and its various entanglements emerged as a key uniting thread, one that even the Marxists and the non-Marxists in the room could agree upon. Okay, so the third, final part of this presentation is thinking the relationship of value to health and politics. And this is the work that I've done more recently in the book Pharmacracy. So in this book, I am arguing that we have to understand the mechanisms by which health gets appropriated by capital in order to understand how health is dictated by logics of capital, how these logics materialize through regimes of governance, and how they are contested and rendered political. In the process, the notion of health itself as it constitutes in relation to emergent forms of experimentation and therapy come to be at stake. Health is no longer just an embodied, subjective, experiential state of well-being or disease. It can be abstracted and grown, made valuable to capitalist interests. It's like labor. So one part of understanding pharmacracy is to elucidate the political economy of the appropriation of health by capital. And this is what I've done through a reading of Dumit. The complementary part of this is to recognize that logics of capital are not seamless. They become deeply politicized, deeply contested, and so undergirding the relations between value and politics are ways of knowing. and questions of what kinds of authorities are vested in articulating these relations, right? So the creation of value on the one hand then speaks to these dynamics of capital that I've talked about, but on the other hand speaks to a historical, empirical, ethnographic question of the ways in which value, politics, and knowledge are intertwined and mediate each other, right? And here, critically, understanding globalization is crucial. And we can talk in discussion about the ways in which globalization might come to be understood. So schematically, in pharmacracy, what I was doing was basically to try and proliferate these articulations of value, politics, and knowledge, right? So I was arguing that the establishment of regimes of value becomes a means through which global hegemonies naturalize and reconfigure such that value itself becomes the grounds upon which politics plays out. Now, in the book, I consider value in 4 registers: as an abstraction that has material consequences, as surplus value for capital, in terms of norms and ethics, and as antinomy, something that is in contradictory relationship to itself. This in turn leads me to think of 5 sides through which value in all of its registers comes to be explicitly articulated through and as politics in relation to drugs. The speculative value of financial capital, the bioethical value that underlies the establishment of good clinical practice for biomedical research, the constitutional values that underlie modes of judicial interpretations of intellectual property law, this is very important in India, philanthropic values that rationalize corporate monopoly, and post-colonial values that contest Euro-American corporate and state hegemony through both market and state intervention. Additionally, I consider politics in terms of 6 emergent forms of and spaces for representation. The conjuncture of policy harmonization is creating openings for flows of global capital and for political mobilizations of global civil society around access to essential medicines and clinical trials. Logics of financialized capital in the spaces of crisis that they create, leading to structural contradictions requiring political reconfigurations of multiple sorts, including more intense forms of financialization. One of the responses to the crisis of financialization is more financialization. Civil society advocacy is activated and mobilized through public scandal, judicialization in the fight to make patents incentivize public good, competing forms of social responsibility as articulated through corporate philanthropy and demanded of the state, and corporate alliance making with civil society groups for access to medicines in the context of an imperialist geopolitics. So some of these politics establish hegemonic modes and relations of production, some of them contest it. Finally, I think through the ways in which articulations between value and politics are mediated by knowledge, which itself has multiple meanings, right? So the kinds of knowledge that emerged for me in my study of pharma were the kinds of scientific and medical knowledge required in drug discovery and development. A lot of that is small molecule organic chemistry. The epidemiological knowledge that underlies public health interventions, various kinds of anticipatory knowledge that operate in different domains, ranging from financial markets to clinical research to patent law, knowledge as process and strategy of making meaning, modalities of reasoning and interpretation that operate in particular situations with more or less authority. And in the Indian case that I study, the courts were very, very important to this, right? So what results then is a more complex, elaborated, and differentiated structure of pharmacracy, which looks something like this. You won't be able to read any of this, but that's how value is entangled, right? There are all of these value emerges through all of these entanglements, even as it operates through the dynamics of capital that Marx and Dumas show so well, right? So what's at stake through and through are the antinomies of value in its multiple registers. An antinomy is a contradiction, and of course I've learned this greatly from Etienne Balibar sitting here. An antinomy is a contradiction between two beliefs or conclusions that are in themselves reasonable. Resolution or consensus is often impossible. What is at stake is living with the mutual incompatibility. Value in the contested, conjoined, multiply jointed senses of market and surplus value on the one hand, and ethical or normative value on the other, precisely because of its inherent indeterminacy, constitutes the terrain of politics, and it's an antinomous terrain. My investments, therefore, do not lie in defining what value really is, and certainly do not correspond in any straightforward way to what people say or believe what value really is. I'm not interested in finding a transhistorical ontology of value, nor am I attempting an elucidation of cosmologies of value. that describe the ways in which actors resolve contradictions for themselves. What I want to do here is to stay attentive to the articulations and antinomies of value as it's rendered political through knowledge. So I'm going to leave it at that.
I have a question for Alex. I didn't know anything about peer review, it turns out, so I learned a lot. One of the things that really struck me, and it may be because of your mention of Al Gore, is that you can fit the history of peer review into the history of regulatory politics. You also mentioned regulatory science. And that science plays a very distinctive role in this context, both as the sort of knowledge that's used for regulation and as also itself a potential subject for regulation. And it's precisely that contradiction that leads to weird flips back and forth as to who's attacking science, right? Depending on whether the science is being used as a basis for regulation or whether science itself needs to be regulated. So Gore in that situation being an advocate of regulation of science, right? And then later on being an advocate of using science to regulate it, right? So, what struck me, and this is where the question comes in, is that in your description of peer review, the focus was on its regulatory, in a different sense, role. Its role as a gatekeeping, its a gatekeeping function, and its role as part of the self-correcting mechanisms of science. But in my own experience, and just thinking about peer review serves other functions. Right? So it helps ensure the editorial legitimacy of publications, right? So it distributes responsibility for editorial decisions, which is different from deciding whether or not a paper is correct or a claim is correct, right? It distributes labor, right? So it divides labor so that the editor doesn't have to literally carefully read everything himself or herself. And it also creates different kinds of social networks social networks that transcend the genealogical relationships or the institutional containers in which people usually learn about science, how it's being done elsewhere, right? And it seems that once you incorporate all those other things into the story of peer review, a simple story of is it correcting science or not, is it eliminating bad science or not, doesn't capture the whole picture. And so I wonder if that's ever part of these discussions, all the other things that peer review does.
So in fact, I sort of skipped over various things. That, of course, what you're saying is absolutely crucial to everything here, right? The idea that these practices are about gatekeeping and gatekeeping alone is preposterous, and you might even say that's not at all what they're. I mean, they do that very badly, and they do lots of other things reasonably well, at least as well as anything else. And so, I sort of rushed through things, but I think what seems to me to happen. So the idea that refereeing might play some of those other roles is part of the conversation in the 70s because it doesn't. This sort of regulatory pressure isn't on it yet. But that seems to me to mostly disappear in most studies of peer review that start to sort of get going in the 80s and 90s. And indeed, so various kinds of things are collapsing. One of the collapses is the idea that the various sorts of self-correction mechanisms, they sort of get collapsed onto particular formal procedures. On the other hand, so that's sort of what happens with refereeing becoming peer review. On the other hand, refereeing itself ceases to be seen as sort of playing various kinds of, so my historical work on the subject has exactly been to say that refereeing had nothing to do with gatekeeping for a large part of history, like nothing. Like it was the opposite. In some ways, it was the opposite of that. And that sort of more fluid notion of what this practice is for and what it might be kind of it just gets smaller and smaller in the ways in which sort of the public discourse about refereeing and then peer review get configured. And so that's one of the things we might want to change. Now, the difficulty is that then it might be that what I'm saying is, it's too bad that political stuff happened in the 80s and things are much better in the 70s, but that's not right because that would be that's a bad kind of story structurally, but it's also not right because what happened. It's not Gore's fault. Gore was perfectly reasonable in his being shocked, I think. But I think one of the reasons he was shocked is actually the people representing the sciences, as it were, had no particular political story to tell, and so one was imposed upon this institution. It seems to me, and what would have been nice, or I think what was missing up until that point, or what had been stripped away already, was some sort of notion that there's a sort of a politics of judgment and a politics of politics of labor, et cetera, embedded in these practices. That was sort of removed over time, or sort of through, I think, the structural functionalism of sociology of science in the 60s and 70s. And then a new kind of politics was imposed upon it that sort of reduced that institution. But absolutely, it's refereeing practices do all sorts of things, and they still do. There's of course just a big distinction in general between the way in which people talk about this institution, the sort of discourse surrounding peer review, and in fact its actual practice. There's a strong notion that it is one thing. It's never been one thing. It's a whole bunch of different sorts of things. And that, again, that was something that was understood in the 60s and 70s more or less, and then more or less sort of ceased to be part of the discourse for the most part, starting in the 80s, it seems to be.
Okay, so let's take a couple of questions, and then join in.
Thank you. Just a comment about the nature of capital coming from pharmacracy, but it also touches on the question of peer review, and that is what the knowledge processes might be becoming in this moment of globalized pharmacracy. One way of posing the question is about open access, and I know that in the open access debates driven by the biotech industry, one of the main drivers for open access is to set up biotech companies that don't have to pay for knowledge acquisition through subscription costs and those sorts of things. In that system, the way that open access is referred to is through publishing results. That's something different than a paper. And the academic paper may be okay for us professors, but I wonder what people now want in the new economy of science, where something else is mobile. It's not just the published paper now that is the kind of gold standard for knowledge. Something else is moving around, and I don't know whether that's commodities or chemicals or pieces of objects or what kind of knowledge this is that might be moving around in a moment when peer review is disappearing as something that people hold in high value in many of the movements. Of course, as an academic, I cherish it very much, but I'm just, other things are going on. I wonder what kind of mobility of knowledge this might be. Thank you.
Joanna, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think about Etienne's question sort of was helping me to form the question I wanted to ask about peer review, which is a question about a different way of thinking about politics, and especially the geopolitical that you ended on, which is thinking about cases where scientists themselves are aware that there are political ramifications of the findings that they have in their hands. And peer review, and I've noticed this in the archive, right? Peer review becomes a place where some of those political debates are adjudicated, but they don't necessarily make it into the published article. And so I'm interested in, so there's a case that I'm thinking of that I've been working on about human biology in Brazil, where these two human biologists have different ideas about what it will mean to see indigenous peoples as having genetic basis for immunity or not, right? And this is happening under like a dictatorship, and there's a sense that if we publish this finding, it could be used against indigenous people in these ways. And none of this really makes it, this back and forth that's going on makes it into the paper itself. And so I guess I'm just wondering about the political in a different sort of register as playing out, not assuming that scientists are not ever concerned with the political, but how can you locate that in your story? And especially, and maybe this does articulate to what Kaushik is trying to reckon with, what does it mean when the kind of networks of research are transnational and those kinds of issues? Like, obviously, this fits into your critique. It can't be accommodated by an automated machine. But how might we be able to harness that archival knowledge, or that knowledge of what's actually happening in the archives of what actual peer reviews or referee reports have looked like, to maybe contest or actively disrupt a narrative of automation? Just putting it out there.
Where should we start?
Okay, understood. Thanks for that question. The simple answer, which of course is not a simple answer, is to the question, what is moving around in this moment, is that many different things are moving around, right? And they can be differentially monetized. And often the same institutions or people are not monetizing them. And so, for instance, one of the things that I was looking at in much older work on genome science, when genomics was becoming something that was valuable to industry, is that what was becoming valuable could be biological material, or it could be information, and it wasn't often the same companies who were monetizing one or the other. And of course, there are actual bodies that are moving around, or knowledge regimes that are moving to bodies elsewhere, right? So the outsourcing of clinical trials, but importantly, very importantly here, the domain of global reproductive politics, things like surrogacy, oocyte donation, and so on, what Melinda Cooper and Catherine Walby call clinical labor, right? So there are lots of mobilities. And so on the one hand, what that means is that it is, sort of capitalization all the way down. But it also means that there are often contestations between these different kinds of appropriations and monetizations, and so on and so forth, right? I just want to say one thing quickly at a more abstract level, right? Which is one of the most useful recent theorizations of contemporary capitalisms that I have read is Sandro Mesadra's and Brett Nielsen's new book, The Politics of Operations, where they talk about what they call the operations of capital as being defined by extraction, logistics, and finance. And one of the things to think about, and one of the things that they're doing there, is that they're thinking about, for instance, data economies as extractive economies in a way that we might think about mining natural resources, right? Like, what does it mean to think about, literally to think about the processes of value extraction across long durées of different things from which value has been extracted? And if you put that in relationship to financialization, and Marx said this in volume 3 of Capital, right? The thing with financial capital is that value is not being created, but it's being appropriated in a process of circulation. So what you need is movement for value rather than production. So the dynamics of this, again, are very long durée. But the particular kinds of resources that get put into motion, out of which value gets extracted, I think there's real empirical specificity and interest.
To this same set of questions, I mean, from my slightly different perspective on all of this, another kind of story that I don't know that much about, but seems very important to the story about why peer review became such a sort of big concept in the last 10, 15 years, is indeed a story that's been told. It's not so much academics who care about this, who have ever cared about it, but when sort of large pharmaceutical companies want to sort of extract knowledge from the academic world, they went and they started realizing, all these studies suck, and they aren't good proper knowledge, and so so this is sort of one source of the sort of narrative that peer review is broken. Peer review, they had this idea that it ought to produce, it ought to add a certain kind of value, the value that makes for truth in all these studies. And insofar as that wasn't the case, everybody kind of knew that wasn't the case, but except maybe then, they said it ought to be the case. And so that's one source of the sort of narrowing of this procedure into this idea that it ought to produce truth. But again, this is something, this sort of, I have very little to say about what's happening now in this regard and what's going to happen. Certainly there's some sort of notion that one might peer review data in the same way, right? And here, this notion of academics ought to give their labor to making sure this data is not only reliable but standardized, and that ought to happen through some sort of peer review system. To Joanna's question, this is a complicated one, because, well, so the particular issue you're referring to involves a really interesting discussion about politics, but one could also imagine cases that weren't so obviously political, in which there's a whole bunch of interesting stuff going on in this back and forth. Is it important in your case that it's a political matter, or?
No, it seemed like a strong
Yeah.
version of a broader argument about using actual archival, thinking back in some ways to like Steph's argument, using actual materials in the archive that are the forms of what we're debating to empirically ground a claim about, what sorts of knowledge is being made in these reviews.
So there is a discourse that sort of is about this, which is that peer review, that referee practices ought to be open referee practices, right? And that's a very, very a big part of the discussion now, right? So moving towards open peer review, in which the idea would be that there's actually a lot of value in this back and forth. It's now, of course, it's electronic for the most part, not so much paper. And I haven't thought through exactly how, in this case, how that changes the situation. But the idea would be that, of course, everything then does get published together, and that sort of creates a sort of more valuable knowledge object. What's tricky about that is it's also part of that same discourse that connects to the sort of platform version of open science, in which that stuff also then, because it's open, can then be sort of harvested for other purposes potentially. And so it's that particular example, it wouldn't seem to me to disrupt the sort of discourse that's going on with respect to the transformation of peer review. But maybe the sort of invocation of the political there might in some way, but I have not thought about it. And it's worth talking about.
Okay, let's take a couple more. I think Raphael, did you have a hand? And then Lucas.
I had a quick question about the beginning of your talk, Alex, about the AI use for peer review. I thought, is part of it because the results could not be reproduced, or the statistical analysis was so flawed that any kind of computerized system could figure that out, tease it out, and therefore, is that part of the motivation?
With that first slide, there's actually a few different things going on there. One of them is this sort of, companies who are claiming to use AI indeed to do some basic statistical analysis, et cetera, to figure out things. And, people are doing that sort of on particular cases now to, show sort of all the fraud going on in various sorts of papers. That's one thing that's going on. I'm somewhat less interested in that and more interested in the sort of notion of sort of algorithmic crowdsourcing of judgment through, counting things such as downloads, but also using AI to read sort of public comments that come from sort of open peer review platforms. That's sort of what I've been focusing on. But there's a lot of work doing this, sort of attempting to sort of automatically decide whether a paper is sort of automatically faulty. I haven't really thought too much about that. I think clearly that kind of work, another huge thread of the story is that all of this tends to assume that knowledge is this relatively standardized, knowledge production is a relatively standardized sort of process. You'll notice many of my actors in post-80s are people in biomedicine. And so a set of issues that are quite relevant to a set of fields within biomedicine become the sort of platform through which discussions of these issues spread throughout all sorts of fields and disciplines, which seems ridiculous in all sorts of ways. But yeah, that is something that's going on.
Thanks. So I have a question for Kaushik about value, and I'm curious about what you would what you would say about thinking not about so much what value is, but rather where it is. I'm thinking in particular kind of along two axes or registers. Spatially, it sounds like you wanted to say that, I'm not sure this is right, but so I'm asking, I'm curious, that value is located in transit, so it's something that's created through circulation, through exchange. And then also along a temporal register, so I'm thinking about what I expect something Joanna's talked about the future, which will be taking place tomorrow. So a kind of classic trope, and I think it's very strong in Marx too, of capitalism as locating value in the future. So you were talking about surplus. Value as something which is kind of money becomes capital when it's invested in the means of production to extract surplus from labor. And so it strikes me in both of those cases, or along both of those registers, there's a kind of sense in which value is always deferred. It's always somehow just out of reach, or it's somehow kind of off. Just out of reach or deferred. And that this may help to account in some ways for the kind of what you might describe as sort of the imperial dimensions of capitalism. That the kind of very concept of value is one that is predicated upon growth and constant kind of movement and deferral and kind of projection into the future.
Thanks. And yes, yeah. I think that's a really nice way of putting. So just a couple of quick things here, right? I think the temporal dimensions of this are vital, and I think the whole question of futurity is very important, and I think that exists already in the question of potentiality that's at the heart of the labor theory of value, right? So it's there in the dynamics itself. Having said that, there are also specific ways in which the future itself is made fungible in historically and institutionally specific ways. And that's things like financialization, right? And this was my question. This is where my question to you, Stephanie, came from, right? Is that when one thinks about a sort of historical transition to securitization, for instance, right? Securitization is a category of finance, amongst other things, right? And so it's all about not just being able to look to the future, but look to the future in ways that allow one to generate value in the present, right? So on the one hand, value is deferred, but on the other hand, somebody's making a lot of money while value is deferred, right? And so the question is, who is value deferred for, right? And who stands to gain through that deferral, right? And I think that becomes a very interesting political question. And so that leads to then the earlier thing, value located in transit. Yes, value is located in transit, but value is also located out of transit, as in people are able to extract, or institutions or whatever, quote unquote, the commercial capitalist in Marx's terms in volume 3 of Capital, right? The commercial capitalist is able to extract value out of transit. And that's an important part of the development. So it becomes important to get things to move for movement's sake, right? As opposed to.
Okay, let's take another two. Suman and then Adam.
Thanks so much to both of you. I've actually got a question for each of you, very different. Alex, it can be phrased kind of simply in the beginning bit, and then it's going to get hard for me to phrase it. But it seems to me that in this lovely paper, you've really stressed the review part of peer review and not the peer part of peer review. And so the obvious set of questions, it came up in that very nice example, actually, where the bonkers claim that the third world doesn't have enough peers of the right kind and hence enough science of the right kind. But I guess part of what I'm interested in is, in the 90s and the last decade and a bit, when there have been critiques of an old boys network, particularly white, particularly male, and so on, whether there has been more emphasis on the problems or the claims or the implicit judgments involved in that notion of the word peer. And in a sense, so that's the first question, and then in a sense, why, given that you're nodding and that's clearly part of what you're thinking about, why an answer to that question wasn't in this version of your talk, right? Because it's clearly important, but I wonder why it's absent in this version, except for, we can't do everything and time is short. And then the question for Kaushik is, I'm always amazed and love all of the directions you can go through these great close readings of Marx, but I have a question about the way that Marx commonly understands value, and in a way the kinds of value that might be limited to you by the fact that you work so much with Marx. So, for example, Marx cannot be reduced only to economics. That would be foolish. He thinks, of course, in terms of moral value, ethical value, and so on. But I do wonder whether a focus on capital and so on, to make it personal, do you find that working with Marx so closely limits some of the kinds of value that are most observable to you, to kind of economic forms of value? And what do you do to make sure that other forms of value are there for you to see when they're in the world, so to speak?
So my question on value is actually, I think, a continuation of Suman's question. Maybe quite naive, but when I think about values, when I started thinking about values many years ago, I was not working with Marx. I was just thinking about moral values. The kind of thing that is lost now in the United States. We lost our values. This president doesn't stand up to our values, etc., etc. And I wonder if there's any ontological or epistemological relation between these values and the values you were talking about. Maybe not. Maybe it's just a different type of creature. But maybe at some point in the history of value, they were together, and there was a split. And I would wonder what you think about this. About peer review, I would like to ask something maybe quite speculative. We may think about peer review as a form of judgment, but also about not just judgment, but judgment mobilized for making a decision. So it's a decision-making procedure, but it's also a mechanism for distributing decision. Just by saying this, we are in the political. Absolutely. So this is the way scientists do politics, their own politics. We can compare it to voting. It's another mechanism of taking decision. Within a specific limited community, not everyone is allowed to vote. And there are, in both cases, there are some values in the other sense of values that give it legitimacy, equal and fair, etc., etc. But we know in both cases that there are so many problems in the way these processes are implemented that undermine the fairness or the equality, etc., of the election or of the peer review judgment. Now, I would like to ask you if you agree to take this one or two steps further and ask how come that scientists do not recognize any of this. From what you said, from what you brought to us, I mean, I don't know about the empirical reason, but the people who speak about scientists speak about them as if they are completely unaware of all of this analogy, and that they conceive them, when they conceive themselves as making the decision, they are not one of the parties, although the mechanism is actually a way to constitute the party, or to reproduce the party, or to transform the party, etc. It seems that they conceive themselves at most as the council, or I don't know how you call it, the committee that supervises the election, you know, if I take the analogy. So you have a neutral bipartisan committee that overlook the election process. So this is how they look at themselves, as one step up, neutralizing or excluding the political in the process.
Two more questions on the list. So, please.
So I'll jump. That's a super interesting set of questions. And unfortunately, the answer is really complicated, so I won't try. And I don't know all of the answer, but one thing that is important to just start with is that once you get into, you know, there's the various sort of scientists, as it were, who are the actors, and then there are people who take themselves to be observers and researchers of this problem, and that sort of group of people, it seems to me, is, you know, they're not coming from political science. They're not thinking about questions of, say, so even if it's take the voting issue, presumably there's different ways of coming at the voting issue. One would be to come at it from the point of view, okay, so what sorts of values do we want the system to embody? Another is to say, what's the most efficient economic way to do this? And that too is sort of political, but it it takes itself to push aside the political. And it seems to me that that's the mode in which a lot of this discourse happens regarding referee systems. Not entirely. I mean, there are very interesting people talking about it in ways that I think we'd find more interesting. Suman, on peer, why peer is missing. You're absolutely right. It's very good you called me on it. It's something I've been thinking a lot about and trying to figure out. I just don't have a good story. So one thing I did say that's very important is that the word peer functions in all sorts of different ways aside from review in this earlier period. But that ceases to be the case in most cases from the 80s on. I mean, it's still around, but peer review becomes a kind of term on its own that is to some extent abstracted from any sort of question about what a peer is. That's not at all true in that earlier sort of moment. But I just haven't figured that story out. And but you're absolutely right that that's going to be central to actually making this a proper good paper, try to understand what's going on I mean, there's obvious things to say, but you can guess what those obvious things would be. There's something non-obvious to say about it that I haven't figured out yet. You're absolutely right.
Okay, gosh, lots of things. So let me say three things that in my head are sort of connected, but it's not going to come out that way. And the third thing that I'm going to say is the answer that I should have given you, Lucas, and I didn't, and I remembered after the fact that this is what I should have told you. Right? So I'm going to end actually with an argument. Okay, so the first thing is, Adi, this isn't an answer to your question, but what you were saying made me think of something very interesting in what I perceive to be a difference in tone in Marx between Volume 1 of Capital, when he's talking about the labor theory of value and surplus value, and Volume 3 when he's talking about what he calls commercial capital, a sort of, if you like, proto-financialization, which is that by the time he reaches Volume 3, there's almost a tone of moral outrage. Like there's almost this sense that sort of the commercial capitalist is a parasite. That, you know, that industrial capitalism is exploitative, but at least it's productive. But financial capital is just, you know, and so there's something already interesting in that trajectory there. That's not the answer to your question, but it's a prelude to what I hope will.
Could you use the mic?
Yeah, sorry. So that was one part of it. Now, from there, Suman, I've started answering this question by talking about what Marx says, but for me, the interest ultimately is not in Marx per se, but in the nature of the problem, the nature of particular problems that I am contending with, that I'm not able to tackle methodologically without help from Marx, right? And this doesn't mean that, and part of the problem that I'm tracing is empirically a trajectory such that both the life sciences and medicine, fields in which I trained when I was young, are unrecognizable to me even in the course of my adult life because they have been capitalized so much, right? Such that, I mean, literally Merton's norms kind of held when I was a baby scientist, and it's unthinkable, right? And so that's what Marx is useful for me for. But, many of my best friends are non-Marxists, but also there are certain questions that cannot fully be asked through Marx. And so one of the things that I am beginning to wrestle with is new work in South Africa, which is a country that I don't know well, and I'm just beginning to. But all of my work on pharmacracy has been talking about monopoly capitalism. In South Africa, it's impossible to talk about monopoly capitalism without talking about white monopoly capitalism. That's the category, right? In other words, race. So how does one think of race within these dynamics, through these dynamics, right? I'm not saying Marx is useless for thinking about race, but it's a different set of problems, right? Where I want to go with this, and this is a jump, but this is the answer that I should have given you, is that in relation to all of these questions, right, which are dealing in some ways with the question of the relationship between the economic and, if you like, the non-economic, right, in the conjunctures and the worlds that we live in. Ultimately, I want to make a political argument, and I will say this. At this point, what I'm about to say is radically at odds with where Sandro Mesadra and Brett Nielsen end up, right? So I find their work very useful for my thinking about capital, but I think we end up in very different places in terms of what our political arguments are. Is that I think that in many important ways, what defines the relationship between the economic and the non-economic in places and times is something like a state. It doesn't have to be a nation state, right? But I think states matter, as in states draw boundaries between, Indian courts and South African courts actually come in at certain moments of the capitalization of health and say, no, this is morality, this is not economics, right? In other words, boundary drawing gets done. And there's political work that's done through that kind of boundary drawing. Whereas the American state, since Reagan especially, has completely abdicated that role. They've basically become an investor state, right? And so part of the politics that I want to, that I think is on the table here is one of seizing the state, right? As in, are we thinking about some kind of a state-based politics? The state may not look like what we know it to look like. It certainly, I think, ought not to be coupled to the nation in any kind of, thick way. But the question of the political relationship between economic and non-economic forms of value, I think, requires a politics towards something like a state. That makes sense. Like that's where your provocations are taking.
Okay, 2 more questions. Laura and then...
Kaushik just answered mine with bells on. So.
Excellent. Then Laura.
So I wanted to ask a question of Alex and link it to Steph's talk earlier in the day, thinking about conversations more recently about databases and fairness questions, and the possibility that maybe the questions ought to be asked, what sorts of things should be kept or not kept. And I should say that I am understanding the history of peer review also through the periodization that I understand from Kaushik's work of just an increasing financialization of data of health from the 1970s. So my question is essentially, what would a history of retraction look like? Because it seems to me that peer review, the process of peer review and the process of retraction are parts of the same story. So that I take for granted that the idea that science was inherently secretive and peer review makes it more open is just sort of a false narrative, but actually peer review creates new forms of secrecy, which I feel like is what Joanna was signaling with the sorts of things that are left outside of publication. And that is it possible that with the increasing value given to claims that can be made and then stricken from the record, those claims are still made, even if they're summoned. Sort of like in courts, when you try to strike things from the record, they nonetheless can have some sort of actual financial value. Is it the case that from, say, the 1970s, there's actually an increased effort to produce retractions because knowledge, I'm thinking of climate change knowledge and the efforts to keep climate knowledge unstable, keep uncertainty in play, that there's an increased effort to create retractions because it's a method of actually making claims that have a value, even if the claims are known to be false.
You mean, so on the one hand, sort of, there's the aspect of this where sort of claims that are sort of made public but then sort of crossed out sort of still exist as claims but in an unstable sort of way. Is the
Yes.
instability of its publicness crucial to this?
Well, for me, that's where the value would lie. I mean, a simpler way to put it is a history of retraction absolutely essential to a history of peer review? Or is history of peer review actually more like a footnote to what is a history of retraction?
Well, so I've been trying to figure out what my story might be about the history of retraction for a while. I mean, in terms of the temporality of it, it's really kind of a 90s phenomenon at best. I mean, there's some retraction that starts happening in the 80s, but there's very little of it. And obviously with my story, it clearly seems to me that indeed this sort of new conception of peer review, that this sort of relatively sort of reduced but very powerful conception of peer review that emerges by the end of the 80s is indeed completely coupled to retraction. Now, why and how? Besides, the story you're telling is a non-obvious story the story you're sort of putting out there is a non-obvious one that might be the case. I don't know whether it's the case or not. This is just research I have not done. But you're absolutely right that these two concepts in their sort of 21st century form are like absolutely coupled to one another. Certainly historically, that's very clear to me, just from a description of what's going on. The causal story about that, I just don't know. So I'm not going to try to speculate.
All right, round break till 5:10. Thank you.